interest of this series not taking 3 years to complete like Legacy of the Pink Panther, it also makes sense to cut out any of the more time-consuming media like the comics, TV shows, or games in order to keep production of this series more or less on track.
I am a horrible liar. Greetings all, I'm Aaron Mills, and welcome back after way too long to Look Up on the Screen, a retrospective of Superman in cinema. Am I bringing this show back just because there's a brand new Superman movie in theaters? Yes. Yes, I am. I'm not going to play coy about it. YouTube is what it is, and finally, one of my projects is relevant to more than just my individual demographic. So there's something else you can either thank or blame James Gunn for. Anyway, last time we talked about Superman Doomsday as the beginning of the DC Universe line of animated movies. And honestly, it was kind of a mess. So now we're going to turn our attention to the next major DC animated film that featured Superman in a leading role. And yes, now it's time to talk about Batman.
Call me Batman.
But do we really have to talk about Batman at this point? While Batman has been a cultural icon at least since 1966, don't even try to argue the point with me. I would argue that without that show, we wouldn't have Batman now. That's how big it was. DC was on the verge of canceling the comic altogether before that show aired. I mean, the only reason anybody even considers Catwoman, Riddler, or the Penguin top-tier Batman villains is because of that show. Catwoman hadn't appeared in the comics for over a decade at that point because they were worried she would violate the comics code, and Penguin and Riddler's appearances were sporadic at best. Oh, and let me get this out of the way as well. This question that I have been asked many, many times since beginning this series. No, I will not be doing a Batman in film retrospective. Because even applying the same rules to Batman that I did to Superman for this series would still leave me with over 40 film projects to look at. And I don't have a decade to do that. If you would like to invest your time and energy for the next decade or so talking about Batman movies, feel free. But Batman's major pop cultural impact, despite being a fixture in shows like Hanna-Barbera's various Super Friends cartoons for years, really began with Tim Burton's 1989 movie. That movie was huge, and I can say that because I was there and in the demographic for it. Seriously, I was around 12 years old when that movie came out, and I had just barely started getting into comics. Growing up, my favorite character on Super Friends was Robin, and when I found out that Batman was primarily meant first and foremost to be a detective, well, my mystery-loving ass got that attention immediately.
Now you want to get nuts? Come on, let's get nuts.
Burton's Batman, its sequel, and Batman the Animated Series were a 1-2-3 punch to the zeitgeist that catapulted the Caped Crusader to the mainstream, which just kept snowballing for the next 35 plus years. So much so that it became obvious that Batman had supplanted Superman as DC's flagship character, despite the efforts of many creative teams to try to correct that issue, or at the very least put them both on more equal footing. Of course, DC would never admit to pushing Batman over everybody else, but so many of DC's editorial decisions throughout the 90s and 2000s, and even into the 2010s, seemed to lean heavily on doing just that. It was kind of hard to ignore. Especially since from roughly 1990 to 2011, there had been approximately 35 ongoing titles published, either starring Batman or one of his supporting cast. During this same period, ongoing published Superman titles topped out at around 17, starring Superman or one of his supporting cast. Now, neither of these totals include titles where both characters are part of team-up books, such as the various events or series featuring the Justice League. During this time, the editorial team working on Superman had decided to present him with one of his biggest ethical challenges. In the early days of the internet, criticism had begun to rise that Superman was more of a defender of the status quo rather than using his powers to actively make the world a better place. This is a theme which we will come back to in another episode. Other sentiments were that the whole truth, justice, and American way thing had come to mean, especially in the wake of the comic that will not die, Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, which depicted Superman as a government stooge, pretty much meant that Superman would just blindly go along with whoever was in the White House at the moment. So, what happens when an egomaniacal billionaire with a chip on his shoulder manages to get himself elected president? I would like to point out that I am talking about a comic story from the early 2000s, and nothing about current events happening at the time this video is public. Not at all.
New polls show that 22% of Americans now indicate a preference for getting in the with a red-hot poker.
Lex Luthor wound up being elected president in the DC Universe in the 2000 election, taking office in 2001. And you can bet your ass Lex took every opportunity to rub Superman's face in it. All this culminated in the first 5-issue story arc of Superman Batman, published in 2003, which revealed that not only had Lex been using his position to make life hell for Superman, including blaming him for a giant kryptonite meteor about to rain devastation on the Earth, but he was also injecting himself with a compound of liquefied kryptonite and the super steroid Venom, the drug of choice for frequent Batman nemesis Bane.
Just taking my supplements, that's all.
Drugs are bad. You shouldn't do drugs.
So, not only is there an egomaniacal billionaire with a chip on his shoulder in the White House, there's a drug-addicted egomaniacal billionaire with a chip on his shoulder in the White House. Again, I am strictly referring to a comic story originally published in 2003, and nothing that has to do with anything that may or may not be happening in the United States at the time this video goes public. Not at all. I have absolutely no idea why you would think that. This storyline, titled World's Finest, in reference to the comic title where Superman and Batman first teamed up, was written by Jeff Loeb with art by Ed McGuinness, and it was a critical and commercial success, getting the new Superman-Batman series off to a good start. So much so that a scant 6 years later, it would be adapted as the 6th entry in the DC Universe line of animated movies, and the second after Doomsday to feature Superman in a leading role. Of course, changes were made. The comic spends a considerable time following both Superman and Batman's inner monologues about the other. The various superheroes that get sent after them tend to be a tad more balanced, specifically in having both Katana and Power Girl seemingly working as inside women in Luthor's circle, and Captain Atom winds up sacrificing himself to destroy the meteor at the story's climax. Luthor would manage to escape in the comics despite being removed from office in absentia in order to set up threads that would later play out in the Infinite Crisis event, which, as a side effect, allowed Luthor to blame everything he did in office on Alexander Luthor, his Earth 3 counterpart. It's very complicated and outside the scope of this show, so if you want to know more about Infinite Crisis, go look it up somewhere else. The movie streamlines things quite a bit, and in fact makes things even more politically charged as it came out right as the popularity of the second Bush administration was taking a severe beating thanks to the ongoing Second Gulf War. I mean, you can't get more explicit than this.
Stock market taking a beating for the 5th straight week. There's a problem.
Housing market continues its sharp decline.
Days of rampant inflation and double-digit
Affecting global markets as well.
Emergency summit to deal with the
Severe
financial
economic downturn.
So, for the benefit of those who haven't seen the movie, Lex Luthor gets elected president and manages to bring a team of superheroes under his direct control, including Black Lightning, Captain Atom, Major Force, and Power Girl, who makes her first official appearance in any DC animated project here. Alright, let's get this out of the way before we move on. Yes, Power Girl is voiced by Allison Mack, who played Chloe Sullivan on Smallville. She was later revealed to be part of the Nixium sex cult and has since served prison time for her involvement. This is not germane to the discussion of the movie, and I am only bringing it up here because if I don't, somebody in the comments will. In fact, now that I think about it, let's get this out of the way as well. Yes, the character of Galatea in Justice League Unlimited was clearly based on Power Girl. However, that character is specifically a villain and does not depicted personality-wise as Power Girl usually is. So as far as I'm concerned, no, she does not count as Power Girl's first appearance in DC animated media. Moving on. Superman, naturally, is not happy about Lex being the president and is convinced he's up to something and continues doing what he does despite Luthor's hero team trying to convince him to play ball for as long as Lex is in office. This doesn't work, but it does get under his skin to the point where he agrees to meet with Luthor privately in Gotham, where Luthor makes it clear what he actually wants.
Does that mean you're willing to work for me?
For you?
Yes, you'll be working for me.
Of course, Lex pulls a double cross because one of his Secret Service men is Metallo, who, after the usual fight, manages to shoot Superman with a fragment of kryptonite. Batman shows up to bail Supes out, but Metallo winds up burying them both alive in one of the graves. The two of them manage to escape to the Batcave via the sewers underneath the cemetery, but when Metallo investigates the explosion Batman caused to get them into the sewers, he encounters someone who turns out to be Major Force, who kills Metallo and gives Lex the opportunity to frame Superman for Metallo's death and put $1 billion bounty on his head. This, naturally, gets the attention of every supervillain on Earth at the moment, who repeatedly attack the duo as they try to figure out how to deal with both Lex and the Meteor. And of course, there's a couple of obligatory fights with Captain Atom and his crew, which come to an end when Power Girl breaches Major Force's suit, causing his powers to run out of control, and Captain Atom takes the energy into himself to prevent a massive nuclear explosion in the middle of Metropolis, basically removing this team of heroes from the movie. Lex's plan to blow up the meteor with missiles fails, and Power Girl takes Superman and Batman to the bunker where he's been working on the calculations on how to stop it. After a brief tussle with Hawkman and Captain Marvel... No, not that one. The original one. Anyway, our heroes disguise themselves as the other two to get inside, where we find out Lex has been shooting up with kryptonite, and it's pretty much made him 2 steps shy of being an outright gibbering lunatic, since he now plans to let the meteor hit and play God by choosing who gets to go in the shelters to survive. Lex deletes all the information on the meteor, including the calculations he was doing on its trajectory, but winds up getting double-crossed himself because Amanda Waller, who has been acting as his right-hand woman through all this, had backed up her own copy of the information and gives it to Superman and Batman so they can save everybody. And while Superman and Batman head off to Tokyo to meet up with one of Batman's contacts, Waller tries to arrest Lex, who eludes her just long enough to get into a powered armor suit and go after them. Remember, this is the streamlined version of this story. In Tokyo, Superman and Batman meet up with Toyman.
Your sinister plan is working perfectly.
No, not that one. There's apparently another Toyman, a 13-year-old robotics genius who Batman has subcontracted to come up with a way to get to the meteor. And boy howdy does he ever.
Back when I designed it, I was way into hero worship.
This is an Easter egg referencing a very goofy Silver Age villain called Composite Superman. No, I will not explain him. Lex shows up to ruin everything, taking Power Girl out in the process, as well as smashing Toyman's computer, preventing the rocket from launching remotely. We get a dual climax as Superman tries to deal with Lex, while Batman flies the rocket to the meteor. We also get Lex's oh shit moment of the movie.
That was my best friend. And you just killed him.
Perhaps I did not think that through.
And basically the last few minutes of this movie is Batman racing into space to meet up with the meteor, while Superman chases down Lex and pummels him into submission, plus a little moment where you think that Supes is going to end Lex because Batman apparently dies when the rocket crashes into the meteor, destroying it. Of course, Batman survives after Superman saves him and Lex gets arrested and presumably impeached. End of the movie. And yeah, it's a pretty decent movie all things considered. It's a little rushed, given that these movies were mandated to have a 70 or so minute runtime at the time of its release, but it gets the general gist of the plot while also toning down some of the comic story's darker elements, and of course removing the dangling plot threads that were left to seed future comic stories. Of course, the big draw for most people was the voice cast, which featured Kevin Conroy, Tim Daly, and Clancy Brown, reviving the roles of Batman, Superman, and Lex respectively for the first time since the finale of Justice League Unlimited, and in Tim Daly's case, since Brainiac Attacks. And all three slip back into the roles flawlessly. Even with the different tone and characterizations from the DCAU, all three adapt to the darker story and events without missing a beat. And Warner Brothers didn't miss a beat in these movies either, because a year later it adapted the next major story arc from the Superman-Batman comic, which, among other things, reintroduced Kara Zor-El into the main DC universe. But we're going to talk more about that next time, as in addition to the return of Supergirl, we're also going to get our first glimpse of one of the most evil beings in the cosmos, Darkseid, in the appropriately titled Superman-Batman Apocalypse. I'm Aaron Mills, reminding you to look up on the screen.